Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Mark Andrew Colonel Holichek, and coming to you from my hermitage in Flint, Michigan. I've been asked by Abbeville Institute to do a book review of Hannah Spahn's new book titled Black Reason, White Feeling. Uh, I didn't quite know what to expect when I got the book, and made several attempts to read through uh, the book. I got through the first two chapters, didn't finish the book, I admit. So, one right off the bat can argue that I'm an unsuited, unmeet critic of the book, but I'll explain why I didn't finish the book. I read through the introduction several times on several occasions and just couldn't make heads or tails of it. Um, and I'll try to explain why. Um, Nonetheless, I am going to offer a review of the book, and one obviously is not going to be too approving. I took a course as a graduate student at Wayne State with Professor Larry Powers, who has passed on since then. It was quite a while ago. And the course was on Hegel. And we had to read his rather thick book, The Phenomenology of Spirit. And Hegel talks about how everything begins with a thesis, and into the thesis there's an antithesis, and the thesis and antithesis collide, and we get a synthesis. And at some point, the synthesis winds up being unsuited, and to that synthesis, there is an antithesis, and synthesis and antithesis collide. We get a second synthesis, and so on. The process keeps going and going and going. I never quite understood what Hegel was trying to get at. I guess I had certain intuitions what he meant, but being an analytic philosopher, my professor was an analytic philosopher. He professed not to know anything what was going on in Hegel's mind at the time. And I did at the time and still do agree with him. But Hannah Spahn's book, which is Black Reason, White Feeling, is in that spirit, the sort of post-Hegelian, postmodernist, deconstructivist hermeneutic spirit of writing about Jefferson and figures of this time. Now, she begins her book by quoting Kant, right? Um, when Kant has a short essay on what is the Enlightenment, and it's an essay that I've used several times in teaching political philosophy. And Kant says the Enlightenment can be, and I'm following Spahn here, can be summed up in the simple formula sapere aude, which means dare, Latin for Greek, Latin for dare to know. She chooses two figures, one of whom is Phyllis Wheatley, an African American poet. And I read her poetry, and I'm fond of it. I think it's intelligent. And Thomas Jefferson, whom she labels simply as a politician. Both of these figures, she says, have been influential, though neither was particularly original. I'm not going to comment on Wheatley's poems because I have not read through them exhaustively. I think they're good. I don't know if they're original or not original. Uh, she then gives us, as she says, each gives us a different version of the Enlightenment. There is Wheatley's Enlightenment of principle and Jefferson Enlightenment of feeling. She says these versions interacted on various levels, sometimes undermining and sometimes consolidating one another. Eventually, they moved beyond their own confines to create a new modernized Enlightenment philosophy. And to quote, one that is neither black nor white, one that is neither male nor female. It is a synthesis that she says of reason and feeling that is at the core of American universalist ideals, right? Hegelian stuff, right? Spahn begins with polarities, white and black, for example. Ideas collide. We wind up with a pleasing synthesis, at least for the time. Till the synthesis proves itself unavailing, we need to move on to another synthesis, another collision of ideas between synthesis and antithesis. Very Hegelian stuff, as I want to say in my review. Hegel is smiling in his grave. Now, what typifies this neo-Hegelian hermeneuticist, postmodernist, or deconstructivist account for Spahn? She uses aplenty technical terms, always undefined, always left somewhat vague, for, according to the postmodernist mindset, the deconstructivist mindset, exposition and being precise makes one vulnerable to criticism. So you don't want to do that. One does not want to be vulnerable to criticism, right? Postmodernism, hermeneuticism, deconstructionism, in fact, make, as I think, obsolete analytic criticism. Precision and clarity are passé, right? That's typical of the sort of modernism that the postmodernist overcomes, right? We go into the modernist view of scientists putting forth precise hypotheses, testing them, and so forth, and confirming or disconfirming them. That sort of stuff is passé. We have gone beyond that, right? Spahn says Jefferson gave us a, I quote, subjectivist epistemology. She writes, his enlightenment of feeling had the primary aim of making the new American nation subjectively plausible to equal Republican citizens. Wow, is a power-packed claim, and I think trying to decipher it is challenging and interesting. So there are problems. One is the problem of convenience, is that Jefferson never says anything like that. Now, of course, if you're a neo-Hegelian, that's not a problem, because precision is not a desideratum. We don't really worry about saying things precisely, So the fact that Jefferson never says anything like that doesn't mean we can't attribute it to him. That leads us into the second problem. The second problem is rather simply stated by me. What does the sentence she gives mean? What does it mean when we say his enlightenment of feeling had the primary aim of making the new American nation subjectively plausible to equal Republican citizens? Now, if we grasp subjectivity as philosophers grasp, as something that is felt or grasped uniquely by the person who's doing the feeling or grasping, right? What is it? How does one pass on this uniqueness of experience, of knowing, of feeling? It's impossible because it's subjective. In other words, a true subjectivist epistemology forbids epistemology. We can't have a theory of knowledge if knowledge is impossible, is if that's experience of knowledge is unique. The best we can have is a sort of solipsism where I know the things that I know, I can't pass them on, and I can't know anything other than things that I know, one of which might be that I exist, right? Solipsism. Now, Spahn hints that the perplexity, befuddlement, is more likely in Jefferson. She says, for Wheatley's disciples, we're not simply inverting his racist allegations in binary terms. These binary, again, Hegel is smiling in his grave, these binary terms, by the tautology of their own intellectual achievements. Instead, they were co-fabricating something new, a Jeffersonian enlightenment capable of consolidating the strengths and overcoming the weaknesses of Jefferson's original Enlightenment feeling. Hegel, a third time, is smiling in his grave. Again, we run into these disconcerting and troublesome problems. The word tautology has a precise meaning in philosophy, one of which it's a term that is used typically by logicians and typically eschewed by non-logicians for a pretty good reason. A tautology means, and it only means, a necessarily true statement. And necessarily true statements are meaningfully vacuous in a manner of speaking. In other words, they're perfectly redundant, right? Consider the statement, a bachelor is an unwidowed male, right? Now, the two terms, bachelor and unwidowed, unmarried, unwidowed male, are mutually entailing in the sense that every bachelor clearly is an unmarried, unwidowed male, and every unmarried, unwidowed male is a bachelor. Right? One might say, and I stretch the reasonable uses of language here when I say that tautologies like this one is so true that it's wholly uninformative. So we're fronted with another vacuous claim when we are exposed to what I call a highfalutin claim, a phrase rather, the tautology of their own intellectual achievements. What does that mean? Tautologies are sentences, necessary truths. Intellectual achievements are not sentences, so they can't be necessarily true sentences. But I can take intellectual achievements, right? I can list intellectual achievements in sentence-like form, but they're not tautologies. So the phrase as part of the sentence is senseless, which makes the whole sentence senseless. Now, Spahn goes on that the Jefferson has bequeathed to us through his enlightenment of feeling his combination of subjectively experienced race, feelings of guilt, and group prejudice, all of which somehow again are perplexing because something cannot be genuinely subjective. Something that is genuinely subjective cannot be shared. Such things plague us to this day, she says, however. His notions of race, feelings, group prejudice, these are things Jefferson intimately experienced and somehow communicated them to us, even though they're subjectively experienced, i.e., incapable of being communicated, but they have been somehow communicated. And fortunate for us, African American intellectuals, she says, have seized on Jefferson's disconcertion and confusion, and they had the insight and motivation to place rational constraints on Jefferson's post-colonial experiments. Again, more highfalutin words that really don't mean a lot. We take something that is incommunicable, Jefferson's unique feelings, they somehow get communicated, at least Black scholars, Black intellectuals understand what Jefferson was trying to say, what Jefferson was feeling, and they sort of decipher them and make them plain and show what Jefferson was really trying to do. And I'll say more on this, right? So through the Black scholars' rational hermeneutics of the Declaration of Independence, I don't know what rational hermeneutics means, because hermeneuticism, all things considered, is really not a rational project in any significant sense of rationality, right? So we talk about the rational hermeneutics of the Declaration of Independence. Here, Black contemporaries, these interpreters are Black contemporaries. Today, Wheatley's disciples, and only they are suitable critics. Okay, so there is some acknowledgement by these critics of Jefferson's achievements, and we can, through these interpreters, explain Jefferson's double consciousness that has become the dominant interpretation of Jefferson's life and writings today. What does all this mean? Jefferson talked of he had feelings somehow, subjective feelings somehow that were communicated to the Black intellectuals, even though subjective feelings cannot be precisely communicated. They interpreted Jefferson's double consciousness, and this interpretation of Jefferson's confusion, the Jefferson saying one thing and then another thing, has been passed on to us today by the Black scholars, by the disciples of the poet Phyllis Wheatley, the Black scholar. And these scholars have helped us to understand Jefferson's confusion. Hence, when all scholars today talk about Jefferson's confusion, um, his saying one thing meaning another, his ambivalence and so forth, him being a walking contradiction, this is all possible in understanding due to Phyllis Wheatley's Black scholars, Black disciples. Now, to dizzy readers at book's end, right? She says Jefferson's contribution as an Enlightenment thinker is the creation of a modern American concept of race as subjective experience, self-consciously based, not on reason and knowledge, but on laissez-faire attitude to both individual pillars of ignorance and deep-rooted prejudices. QED. What does that mean? How the hell do I know? I'm as confused as you are. Typical of the hermeneutic way of expressing this way of deconstructing things, right? We have a lot of highfalutin terminology thrown together in a sentence, subjective experiences, and I don't know what any of this means. Hence my unwillingness to read through the whole of the book. Now, as I end my essay, when I'm submitting to Abbeville, I say that astute readers will notice that, in terms of the references and pagination, I don't go much beyond page 6. I did read through the first 2 chapters to see if there's any possibility of a skewed interpretation of my critique, and there isn't. She does read quite a bit of the literature that Jefferson read, and she does have a pretty good grasp of it. It's just that how she packages everything is infinitely perplexing and confusing, and I think completely ineffective. Right? Postmodernist verbiage again, deconstructionist verbiage, hermeneutical verbiage. So if one wants to say that I'm not a suitable critic of a book that I have not read through completely, then that's the case. I do add, though, that from what I've read, her sentences are movingly, I read from my review, movingly festooned. That's a good Christmassy term. Movingly festooned with terms like enlightenment of feeling, enlightenment of principle, which is Wheatley, enlightenment of feeling is Jefferson, tautology, version, sometimes undermining, sometimes consolidating, rational hermeneutics, whatever that means, and a new American nation subjectively plausible to equal Republican citizenship. The last phrase is perplexingly confusing to me. I don't know what it means. Okay, so I end this by conceding that perhaps I'm not perhaps it'd be better to have a deconstructionist, postmodernist, or hermeneutic or neo-Hegelian, right, critique her book, not an analytic philosopher, an analytic historian. To those who would argue that, I reply what a Hippocratic physician in the aphorisms once said, Hippocratic work aphorism once said, in ancient Greek, hobias brachus I de techni macri. Translated, as we all know this, we've heard this, life is short, art is long. Technique could mean something like art, science, or craft. Life is short, art is long. Put specifically in the most vulgar terms, which I can communicate in vulgarity equally as well as formally. If the early parts of the book are incomprehensible and indecipherable, is there any reason to believe that the rest of it will be comprehensible and decipherable? If there isn't, shelf it and turn to another book. So I'm sorry to say I give a thumbs, two thumbs down to Hannah Spahn's book. I know she put a lot of work into it, and in the content, she gets right quite well at times some of Jefferson's references to other scholars like Kames, David Hume, and Adam Smith, and other people. I just don't, I can't claim to understand when people are writing a sort of neo-Hegelian work how we're supposed to make sense of this. Um, Perhaps the objection would be you're not supposed to make sense of it. You're supposed to read it and enjoy it and look at it as a possible interpretation of, understanding Thomas Jefferson. Doesn't work for me, so Hannah Spahn, I applaud the effort. I applaud your interpretation of Jefferson at times. I just don't understand in the least what you're trying to say in the book, at the beginning or at the end. Anyway, hope you enjoyed this critique of Spahn's book, and TTFN. Ta-ta for now. We'll do this again next week. Take care.